Everyone believed billionaire Frederick Williams' baby had been born blind. Doctors confirmed it. Specialists gave up. Even Frederick himself stopped hoping. 4 months, his infant son Tyler lived in silence. Never reacting, never smiling, never seeing. Then came Regina Palmer, a 25-year-old maid from a small town, hired only to keep the mansion in order. She had no medical training, no prestigious title. But what she noticed one quiet morning would change everything. One small moment, in a simple bath, revealed a truth no one else had seen. And from that day on, nothing would ever be the same again. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. The world had once belonged to Frederick Williams. At just 35, he was the face of brilliance in the tech industry. A billionaire whose sharp instincts and bold innovations had turned a modest startup into an empire. His name filled headlines, his face graced the covers of glossy magazines, and the society pages chronicled his glamorous life with his wife, Isabella. They were the golden couple, young, beautiful, untouchable. When they walked into a room, conversations paused. When they hosted galas, the city's elite came running. But all that changed on a rain-slicked highway one ordinary evening. The night of the crash was burned into Frederick's memory with the permanence of a scar. Isabella had been driving back from a charity gala in Manhattan, her laughter still ringing in his ears from a call minutes before. He had stayed home with their newborn son, Tyler, a rare moment of domestic stillness in a life otherwise consumed by power and business. Then the phone rang again, but this time it wasn't Isabella. It was the police. The car had spun out, collided with the guardrail, and flipped. Isabella was gone before the ambulance even reached the hospital. Frederick would never forget standing under the harsh white hospital lights, the sterile smell of antiseptic in the air, and hearing the words, "I'm sorry, Mr. Williams. We did everything we could." In that moment, the billionaire who once felt invincible was reduced to a broken man holding his infant son, who slept soundly, unaware that his world had already collapsed. In the weeks that followed, grief hollowed Frederick out. He withdrew from boardrooms, ignored the endless emails from his company, and declined the invitations that kept pouring in from politicians and celebrities. The tabloids speculated, the markets trembled at his silence, but Frederick no longer cared. The mansion on the Hudson River, once a stage for glittering parties, became his fortress. Its glass walls, designed to let in endless light, now felt suffocating, as though even the sun respected his morning and dimmed its brightness when it touched his home. The halls of the mansion echoed with silence. The laughter that once bounced off the marble floors had vanished. Staff spoke in hushed tones, their footsteps muted as if afraid to disturb the fragile stillness. Frederick roamed the rooms like a ghost, his tall frame bent with exhaustion, his once pristine suits replaced by plain sweaters and unshaven stubble. He avoided mirrors. He couldn't stand the sight of his own face, lined with grief and guilt. At the center of his shattered world was Tyler. The baby was only a few months old when Isabella died, a tiny bundle of fragility with pale skin and wide eyes that seemed permanently fixed on nothing. When Frederick brought him to specialists, desperate for answers, they delivered another blow. "Your son was born blind," they said, their clinical voices cutting like knives. "His eyes don't respond to light. There's no cure." The diagnosis crushed him. He had already lost his wife. Now it felt as if he had lost his son, too, not physically, but to a darkness Frederick could neither touch nor fight. He wanted to argue, to demand second opinions, to believe that money could buy a miracle. He called specialists from across the world, men and women who charged more for an hour than most earned in a year. They all said the same thing. Tyler's eyes did not see. The boy would never watch a sunrise, never meet his father's gaze, never glimpse the world his mother had loved. Frederick's grief became obsession. If the world outside could no longer offer him joy, he would pour everything he had left into Tyler. He refused to hire a nanny, despite endless offers. He did not allow strangers near his son, convinced that only he could protect him. He read manuals on infant care, memorized feeding schedules, and spent hours rocking Tyler in his arms. He filled the nursery with toys that blinked and rattled, bought music boxes that played gentle symphonies, and decorated the walls with vibrant colors Isabella had chosen before the crash. But the room remained lifeless. Tyler never reached for the toys, never smiled at the music, never blinked when sunlight streamed through the windows. His little face was calm but vacant, eyes open yet empty. At night, Frederick would sit in the rocking chair, cradling his son against his chest, and whisper to him. He told Tyler about Isabella, her smile, her laugh, the way she would sing while cooking. He told him stories of the world, of the stars above the Hudson, of the future he had once dreamed for him. But there was never a response. The baby lay still, his tiny breaths the only sign of life. The weight of guilt gnawed at Frederick constantly. He replayed the night of the crash again and again, tormenting himself with questions he could never answer. What if he had driven instead of Isabella? What if he had asked her to stay home? What if he insisted the driver should her drive that night? What if his success hadn't demanded so many nights out, so many long drives alone in the dark? Now he was left with nothing but a silent child and the memory of what could have been. The mansion became his cage. He avoided the city, the people, the life he once ruled. His friends stopped calling. His company operated without him, executives whispering that Frederick Williams was finished. The only thing he still cared about was Tyler. He woke with him, fed him, bathed him, held him close as if by sheer force of will he could reach into the darkness and pull his son into the light. But the silence was relentless. Each day was the same, the toys untouched, the music unheard, the gaze unfocused. Each night, the same questions haunted him. Does he know I'm here? Does he feel my arms? Does he recognize my voice? Or is he lost inside a world I cannot enter? And yet, in that silence, in that suffocating grief, Frederick clung to a single thread. Tyler was all he had left of Isabella. Blind or not, vacant or not, he was her gift, her legacy. If Frederick had to spend the rest of his life carrying him through the dark, then so be it. He didn't know it then, but change was coming. Unexpected, uninvited, and life-altering. In the form of a young woman who would walk through the gates of his mansion and see what no doctor had seen. Morning in the Williams mansion always began the same way, with silence. The staff arrived early, their footsteps soft against the marble floors, their voices hushed as though the house itself demanded reverence. They polished mirrors that never reflected laughter anymore, dusted chandeliers that no longer lit parties, and folded linens in guest rooms that hadn't been used since the night of the crash. But for Frederick, mornings began in the nursery. He would push open the door and be greeted by walls painted in soft yellows and blues, decorated with cheerful animals Isabella had chosen. A mobile of stars and moons hung over the crib, its delicate shapes turning slowly when he wound it. In another life, this room might have been alive with giggles and babbling. Now it felt staged, like a display in a store window, bright in color, yet stripped of meaning. Tyler lay in his crib, eyes wide but unseeing, his small hands curled loosely by his sides. Frederick would lean over him, force a smile, and whisper, "Good morning, my boy." His voice cracked more often than not. He would pick him up, feeling the warmth of his little body, and hold him close, searching for even the smallest response, a blink of recognition, a twitch, a coo. There was nothing. Still, Frederick tried. He always tried. He opened the curtains wide, letting sunlight pour across the floor, flooding the room with gold. He spoke softly, hoping his words could reach beyond the blank stare. He shook a rattle near Tyler's ear, bright beads clicking inside, but the baby's eyes never shifted. He pressed play on a music box that sang lullabies in delicate notes, waiting for a smile, a flinch, anything. The boy's expression stayed calm and distant, as though the world around him did not exist. Every toy in the room was chosen with care. Stacked blocks in red, green, and blue. Stuffed animals with soft fur and stitched smiles. A ball that chimed with bells when rolled across the floor. Frederick placed them all around Tyler, his hands trembling with hope. "Look, son," he whispered, kneeling on the rug. "These are for you. Can you reach for them?" But Tyler's little arms never lifted. His gaze, wide and vacant, never strayed from the ceiling above. As days bled into weeks, Frederick's desperation deepened. He tried reading aloud, business articles, novels, Isabella's favorite poetry, his voice breaking in the empty air. He switched languages, speaking the little French and Spanish he remembered from travels. He even sang, though his voice was low and rough, a sound Isabella used to tease him about. Still, silence pressed back against every effort. At times he wondered if his son even heard him. Doctors assured him Tyler's hearing was fine, but the stillness was unbearable. No laughter, no crying, not even fussing in the night. Just silence. It was as if the boy was locked inside a shell, unreachable. Frederick carried the weight of guilt everywhere. When he looked at Tyler's face, he saw Isabella's features, the curve of her mouth, the soft shape of her eyes. He asked himself the same questions each night. Does he know me? Does he know I love him? Or is he adrift in a darkness I cannot pierce? The answers never came, only the quiet rhythm of the child's breath. The house was a museum of grief. Every polished surface, every immaculate corner preserved what had been lost. And at its center, Frederick moved like a curator of sorrow, tending not to artifacts but to his silent son. Each evening, when the world outside dimmed and the Hudson glowed with fading light, Frederick carried Tyler upstairs. He bathed him gently, his hands careful, as though the boy might shatter. He dried him with soft towels, dressed him in onesies Isabella had picked out months before she died, and laid him back in the crib. Then he sat in the rocking chair, whispering stories into the void. The silence never broke. And so the days passed, each one heavy with despair, each one pressing Frederick deeper into solitude. The man who once shaped the future with his innovations now found himself powerless, pacing the same rooms, asking the same questions, and clinging to a child who seemed locked away from him forever. The bus rolled into the small town station just after dawn, its brakes hissing as it came to a stop. Regina Palmer stepped down the metal steps with a modest suitcase in one hand and her contract letter folded neatly in the other. At 25, she looked older than her years, not from lines on her face but from the heaviness in her eyes, the kind that came from carrying grief too long. She had learned to keep her back straight, to move with quiet dignity, but the weight never left her. Her life had unraveled months earlier when she lost her newborn son during childbirth. The doctors had called it an unforeseeable complication, something no one could have prevented. But Regina didn't believe them. In the lonely silence of her small apartment, she replayed every moment, every decision, every sound of that night, searching for what she might have done differently. She had cradled her child's tiny body for only a few hours before he was gone. That loss hollowed her out. She quit her job at the hotel where she cleaned rooms, stopped answering calls from friends, and eventually disappeared from the circles of people who once cared for her. When she saw an advertisement for a live-in maid position at a mansion along the Hudson River, she applied without hesitation. She didn't care about the pay or the name of the family who owned it. She only wanted to leave behind the familiar streets where every corner reminded her of her baby's absence. This job felt like a chance to vanish into work, into silence, where no one would ask questions or whisper condolences that cut deeper than knives. A black sedan was waiting for her at the station. The driver didn't speak much as they drove along winding roads that eventually opened up to reveal the Williams estate. Massive iron gates loomed ahead, opening slowly with an electronic hum. Beyond them stretched a driveway lined with trimmed hedges, leading to a white mansion that glowed faintly under the pale morning sky. It looked immaculate, almost too immaculate. The car stopped at the steps, and the driver gestured for her to get out. Regina stood still for a moment, taking in the sight of her new world, towering windows, flawless stonework, manicured lawns. It was the kind of place she had only seen in magazines, yet something about it felt strangely empty, like a stage set after the actors had left. The front door opened, and a tall man in a black suit appeared. His expression was stiff, his posture rigid. "You must be Miss Palmer," he said without warmth. "I'm Mr. Harris, the butler. Follow me." Regina nodded politely. She expected coldness. Wealth often carried it like perfume. Inside, the house gleamed. Every surface shone as though polished daily, every piece of furniture perfectly placed. Yet there was no life in it. The air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Mr. Harris walked her through the first floor, his tone clipped and efficient. He pointed out the kitchen, laundry area, dining hall, and a sitting room. Each space was pristine but strangely unused. Blankets folded with precision lay untouched. The dining table was set with silverware, but it looked as though no one had sat there for months. As they moved toward the staircase, Regina caught sight of something through a half-open door. A playroom. Brightly colored blocks were scattered on the floor. A teddy bear slumped against the wall. Yet no laughter filled the space, no movement disturbed the air. The silence was deeper than the rest of the house, as if joy itself had been locked out. She slowed her step, peering in. That's when she saw him. On a beige playmat sat a small boy, still, unervingly still. His wide eyes stared straight ahead, unfocused. A toy car rested in one hand, but he didn't move it, didn't even seem to remember he was holding it. His face was calm, almost too calm, like a doll placed carefully on display. Regina froze. She had worked around children before, cleaning houses where toddlers tumbled across floors or babies wailed from cribs. Even quiet children fidgeted, fussed, reacted. But this boy was different. His stillness wasn't peace. It was absence. Mr. Harris noticed her hesitation and cleared his throat. "That's Tyler, Mr. Williams' son," he said flatly, as though the boy were another piece of furniture to be catalogued. "Don't try to engage with him. He doesn't respond." Regina's throat tightened, but she said nothing. She followed Harris up the stairs to her quarters, a modest room with a narrow bed, a small closet, and a single window overlooking the garden. She thanked him quietly when he handed her a schedule and left her alone. But her mind remained in that playroom. That night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, she closed her eyes and saw Tyler's face. The blank expression, the unfocused stare, the tiny hand limp around the toy car. It reminded her of something she didn't want to remember. Her own child, in those last fragile hours before he slipped away. The resemblance pierced her like a blade. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, refusing to let tears fall. She had promised herself she would not cry anymore. She had come here to work, to bury her grief in duty. But lying in the dark, she realized that something in that boy's stillness called to her. Regina hadn't come to this mansion looking for connections. She hadn't come seeking meaning. Yet in Tyler's haunting silence, she felt a pull she couldn't explain. It was as if his emptiness recognized hers, and together, in some unspoken way, they reached across the quiet. She didn't know it yet, but this fragile thread between her buried grief and his silent condition was the beginning of something neither of them could have imagined. The first time Regina bathed Tyler, the mansion was so quiet she could hear her own breathing. Morning light spilled through the tall windows of the bathroom, glinting off polished marble and casting soft shadows across the wide tub where she had placed a small plastic basin. Bath time had become part of her duties after a week at the estate. Mr. Harris, the butler, had explained the routine in his usual clipped tone. "The boy doesn't react. Just complete the steps carefully." His instructions sounded mechanical, as though Tyler were an object to be maintained, not a living child. But to Regina, this task carried weight. It was the only time she was allowed to hold him for longer than a few minutes, the only time she could study his face closely without being watched. There was something in his stillness that unsettled her, something that felt too familiar, echoing the memory of her own baby's final hours. She undressed Tyler carefully, folding his soft onesie and setting it neatly aside. His body was warm but limp, his tiny arms hanging loosely by his sides. His wide eyes, as always, stared into nothing, pupils fixed and unresponsive. Regina lowered him slowly into the basin, supporting his head with one hand. The warm water rose around his chest, tiny bubbles forming along his skin. He didn't flinch. He didn't squirm. He simply lay still, as though the water were air. Regina dipped a sponge into the basin, squeezed it gently, and began to wash his arms in slow circles. The foam clung to his delicate skin, sliding over his shoulders and chest. Her hands were steady, but her thoughts raced. She remembered how her own baby used to fuss in the bath, how he would splash with tiny kicks. Tyler did none of that. Minutes passed. The only sounds were the soft drip of water and the faint echo of her movements in the cavernous room. Regina leaned closer, her eyes locked on his blank face. She needed, to see something. Anything. She dipped the sponge again and raised it to his forehead. Warm foam rolled gently across his skin. A single bubble slipped downward, trailing toward the corner of his eye. And then it happened. Tyler blinked. It was quick, almost imperceptible. But Regina froze, her hands suspended in midair, her heart thudding in her chest. She stared at him, unblinking herself, afraid she had imagined it. His face stilled again, the same calm mask as always. Her breath caught. Slowly, carefully, she repeated the motion, this time brushing the sponge gently across his other eyebrow. Another tiny stream of bubbles slid near the opposite eye. Tyler blinked again. Regina's body went rigid. The sponge trembled in her hand. That wasn't a reflex. She knew the difference. This was deliberate. It was a reaction. Before she could steady herself, she heard a faint sound. At first she thought it was the water shifting, but then she saw his lips part ever so slightly. A soft whisper escaped, almost like a sigh, but more shaped, more intentional. It was fragile, barely audible, but it was sound. Regina's eyes widened. Her throat tightened as if the air itself had thickened. For weeks she had watched him, silent and unresponsive, and now, with nothing more than a trickle of foam, he had blinked. He had made a sound. Her hands trembled as she lowered the sponge back into the basin. She couldn't look away from his face. Tyler's eyes shifted. Not much, not fully, but enough. A slight motion, as if his gaze had adjusted for the first time in his short life. "No," she whispered under her breath, barely daring to believe. Not possible. And yet, she had seen it. Twice. Regina sat frozen for several seconds, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever fragile thread had just been woven between them. Tyler's face remained calm, his little chest rising and falling with slow breaths, but something about him felt different. Present. She resumed bathing him carefully, her hands gentler than ever, but her mind spun. Every detail replayed in her memory. The foam, the blink, the sound. It couldn't have been random. She knew children. She had worked around them before. Reflexes had a rhythm, an emptiness. But what she'd just seen, it was a response. When she lifted him from the basin and wrapped him in a towel, she held him longer than necessary. His head rested against her shoulder, his body warm, and for the first time since she had arrived at the mansion, she felt a spark of connection. As she dried him and slipped him into a fresh white onesie, she whispered softly into his ear. "Tyler, can you hear me?" There was no answer, only silence. But she wasn't discouraged. Not this time. Regina laid him gently on the playmat in the nursery, his small hands curling loosely around a stuffed bear. She lingered, crouching beside him, her eyes fixed on his face. His stare was still distant, still blank, but she had seen it. Twice. The blink. The sound. She pressed her hand to her chest, steadying the wild beat of her heart. The doctors had said he was blind. The staff had insisted he was unreachable. His father had resigned himself to silence. But Regina knew what she had witnessed. She stood slowly, her legs trembling, and walked back toward her small room. Every step echoed in her ears. The house was still a mausoleum, the halls lined with grief, but inside her, something had shifted. She sat on her bed that night, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The moment replayed endlessly, the foam trailing down, the blink, the sound. Could it be possible? Could this child everyone had given up on actually see something? Feel something? The thought both terrified and electrified her. Could he? She whispered into the darkness, her voice breaking with a hope she hadn't allowed herself in months. She didn't know the answer yet. But for the first time since arriving at the mansion, and maybe for the first time since her own loss, Regina felt a flicker of purpose. And it came from a baby the world had already declared lost. In the days that followed that first miraculous blink, Regina became more observant than ever. She carried out her duties quietly, dusting rooms, folding linens, preparing Tyler's meals, but her eyes were always drawn to the boy. Each morning she waited for the smallest flicker of change. A twitch of his lips, a shift of his gaze, the faint sound of breath forming into something more. Sometimes she caught it, sometimes she didn't, but she knew in her bones that something had awakened. And then she noticed the drops. It happened one afternoon. She was in the nursery straightening the blankets when Mr. Harris entered with his usual stiff posture, holding a small amber bottle. He didn't greet her, didn't even acknowledge her presence. Instead, he leaned over Tyler, pulled down the boy's lower eyelid with practiced ease, and let a few clear drops fall into each eye. Tyler didn't flinch, didn't cry. He simply sat there, silent as ever. Regina frowned. She had assumed the boy was on some sort of treatment, but she had never seen the medicine administered so closely. After the butler left, she stayed behind, watching Tyler carefully. At first, he seemed no different, but within minutes his faint responsiveness dulled, like a candle snuffed out. The slight presence she had begun to sense in him vanished, leaving only the same vacant stillness she remembered from her first day. Her chest tightened. That night, long after the house fell into silence, Regina replayed what she had seen. The blink in the bath had been real. The sound had been real. But afterward, when the drops were given, he had seemed to retreat again, locked back into that unreachable state. She began paying attention. Every afternoon, without fail, someone came with the bottle. Sometimes Mr. Harris, sometimes a nurse. Every time, Tyler slipped deeper into blankness. And every morning before the next dose, he seemed ever so slightly more alive. His eyes blinked when the curtains were drawn, his lips parted as though words lingered just out of reach, his fingers twitched when she brushed them with her hand. By afternoon, after the drops, all of that was gone. It wasn't coincidence. It couldn't be. One morning, when no one was looking, Regina picked up the bottle left on the nursery table. The label was old, its print faded and peeling from the glass. She held it up to the light. Some of the words were blurred, the expiration date smudged, but what she could read made her heart race. The drug was designed for light sensitivity, something prescribed to patients who found brightness painful. It wasn't meant for infants. And the date had passed months ago. Her fingers trembled. She placed the bottle back exactly as she had found it, but her mind spun wildly. Why would they be giving this to him? That evening, after retreating to her small room, she pulled out her phone and searched the name of the medicine. It took time, scrolling past medical jargon she barely understood, but slowly the pieces came together. The side effects listed were chilling, blurred vision, suppressed pupil response, slowed adjustment to light. In other words, it could mimic blindness. Regina sat back on her bed, staring at the glow of her phone screen as her heart pounded. The truth pressed against her like a wave. What if Tyler had never been fully blind at all? The thought was too large to grasp. She remembered Frederick's hollow face, the way he whispered to his son in the night, believing he would never be seen or known. She remembered the mansion, a museum of grief, built around a diagnosis that might not even be true. Her stomach twisted. Was this negligence? A mistake? Or something darker? In the days that followed, her anxiety grew. She began keeping mental notes of the timing of the drops and Tyler's reactions. In the hours before his next dose, his gaze seemed sharper, his little hands more responsive. After the drops, he became a statue again, robbed of even those faint sparks of life. She wanted to scream it to Frederick, to tell him what she had discovered. But each time she imagined it, fear stopped her. Who was she to question the treatments? She was only the maid, a young woman with no medical training, carrying her own broken past. What if she was wrong? What if he dismissed her, or worse, sent her away? And yet, she had seen him blink. She had heard him make sound. Those things could not be explained away. Regina's nights became restless. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, torn between silence and truth. On one hand, keeping quiet meant safety, keeping her job, keeping her place in the mansion, and staying near Tyler. On the other hand, silence might mean condemning him to a darkness that wasn't his to bear. Each morning, she steeled herself as she carried Tyler to his bath. She watched the foam gather near his eyes and prayed for another reaction. Each time he blinked, each time his lips quivered with the shape of sound, she felt her conviction harden. This was not blindness. This was suppression. And if that was true, then the entire foundation of Frederick's grief, the endless silence of the mansion, the weight of hopelessness, was built on a lie. By the end of the week, Regina could no longer shake the thought. She found herself lingering outside Frederick's office door, debating whether to knock. She imagined his face, weary and haunted, and wondered if she could withstand the anger or disbelief her words might bring. Her hand lifted, trembling, but she let it fall before touching the door. Not yet. She needed more proof. She turned away, walking back to her small room with the image of Tyler's empty eyes burned into her mind. Except she no longer believed they were truly empty. She had seen what no one else had dared to look for. The question gnawed at her constantly, pressing against every corner of her thoughts. Could this child everyone had given up on actually see? The bathroom was warm with steam, sunlight filtering through the high windows and pooling across the marble floor. Regina knelt by the basin, gently lowering Tyler into the water as she had done so many times before. She hummed softly under her breath, not a song but a rhythm, steady, soothing. Tyler's small body rested against her arm, his skin glistening with bubbles. She dipped the sponge, brushed it across his forehead, and watched closely. For days she had been waiting, searching for confirmation of what she believed. Her heart beat faster with every second of silence. And then it came. A stream of foam slid near the corner of Tyler's eye, and he blinked. Not once, but twice. His lips parted, and a soft sound escaped. Ma. Regina's breath caught. She froze, staring at him, her pulse thundering in her ears. Tyler, she whispered. He blinked again, and this time his tiny hand lifted, unsteady but deliberate, reaching toward her face. His fingers brushed her cheek. For the first time since she had met him, his eyes seemed to focus, not perfectly, but enough. He was following her. Tears stung her eyes. She raised her hand slowly, moving it from side to side. Tyler's gaze tracked it. Clumsy, unsure, but real. A sob tore from her chest, muffled by her hand. He could see, at least enough to know she was there. Tyler, she whispered, choking back tears. Sweetheart, you see me, don't you? The door creaked. Regina spun around, startled, to see Frederick standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. He had come in quietly, perhaps intending only to check on them, but what he saw rooted him in place. Tyler's hand remained stretched toward Regina. His little eyes, wide and blinking, followed the movement of her fingers. Frederick's mouth opened, but no words came out. He stepped forward slowly, as though afraid the scene might vanish if he moved too quickly. What is this? His voice trembled, breaking the silence of the room. Regina swallowed hard, her heart hammering. She wanted to explain, but words failed her. Instead, she lifted her hand again, moving it gently from one side to the other. Tyler's gaze followed, his tiny face lighting with the faintest smile. Frederick gasped. He dropped to his knees beside the tub, his hands gripping the edge as if to steady himself. His eyes filled with tears he hadn't shed in months. No, they said, he's blind. They told me he couldn't. His voice cracked into a whisper. My son. Tyler blinked again, his small mouth shaping a soft, broken sound. Ma. The word echoed in the tiled room, fragile but undeniable. Frederick's body shook. He reached out with trembling hands, but stopped short, afraid to break the moment. His eyes darted to Regina, desperate and filled with questions. How? How is this possible? His voice was raw, stripped of the polished authority that once commanded boardrooms. Tell me what's happening. Tell me this is real. Regina could barely breathe. She looked at him, her own cheeks wet with tears. It's real, she whispered. I've seen it before. He responds. He isn't completely blind. Frederick pressed a hand over his mouth, a sob breaking free. He shook his head in disbelief, torn between joy and rage, hope and terror. For the first time in months, the silence that haunted the mansion was shattered, not by grief, but by the fragile voice of a child. Frederick stood frozen, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and longing. He had just seen his son, his silent, unresponsive boy, turn his head toward Regina's hand, track her movement, and whisper a word so fragile it could have been mistaken for the wind. For a moment, the entire world seemed to tilt. The air in the bathroom was thick with steam and the faint scent of lavender soap, Yet Frederick felt cold, unsteady. His mind raced through years of dark nights, countless consultations, and the verdicts of specialists who had spoken with clinical certainty. Your son will never see. Your son is blind. But he had just seen Tyler blink. He had heard him speak. No, Frederick whispered to himself, shaking his head as though trying to erase what his eyes had shown him. No, that can't be real. It's just reflex. A trick of the light. It doesn't mean anything. Regina, still cradling the boy in a towel, looked up at him with quiet intensity. Her heart hammered in her chest. It means something, Mr. Williams. You saw it. You heard it. Don't deny what just happened. Frederick's face twisted with anguish. He staggered backward into the hallway, one hand gripping the wall for balance. Don't do this to me, he said hoarsely. Don't give me hope when there's none. I've built my entire life around this truth. He's blind. That's what the doctors said. That's what I've accepted. If I let myself believe otherwise, his voice broke. And it turns out to be false, I won't survive it. He turned and walked away, retreating to the sanctuary of his study. The room, lined with towering shelves of books he no longer read, had become his cave of grief. He dropped heavily into the leather chair behind his desk, pressing the heels of his hands to his eyes as if to block out the image of his son's blinking gaze. Moments later, there was a soft knock. Regina stepped inside, still holding Tyler against her shoulder. The baby's tiny fist clutched at the fabric of her blouse, his dark eyes fluttering open and closed as though adjusting to the lamplight. Frederick raised his head. Why are you here? His tone was clipped, defensive, the voice of a man unwilling to be torn open any further. Because you need to hear this, Regina said firmly. She walked forward, her steps steady despite the storm inside her. I've been watching Tyler since I arrived. I've seen things I can't ignore. The blinking. The way he sometimes reacts when the drops wear off. Tonight wasn't an accident. He's been trying to tell us something all along. Frederick shook his head, but she pressed on. The eye drops, she said. I started noticing the pattern weeks ago. After they were given to him, he went completely still, like a doll. But when they wore off, I saw flickers of response, tiny changes. I couldn't shake it. So I researched them. She reached into her apron pocket and placed a folded printout on his desk. Those drops weren't meant for blindness. They suppress light sensitivity. And they expired years ago. Frederick's eyes flicked to the paper, then back to her. His jaw clenched. That's impossible. Those were prescribed by... He stopped himself, his voice trailing into silence. By a doctor who was later discredited. Regina finished for him. I looked into it. He lost his license for malpractice. For prescribing things that harmed more than they helped. The words hit Frederick like a physical blow. He pushed back from the desk and strode to the cabinet where Tyler's medical records had been stored for years, untouched because he had trusted the experts. His fingers fumbled as he pulled the thick binder free, scattering old reports across the desk. He flipped page after page until the name leapt out at him like a ghost from the past. The doctor. The very one Regina had named. Frederick's knees buckled, and he sank into the chair again, his head in his hands. His voice was ragged. All this time, all these years, was it a lie? Regina placed Tyler gently in his crib, then stepped closer. Her voice softened, carrying both empathy and steel. Maybe not a lie. Maybe just neglect. But you saw him tonight. You heard him. That wasn't in your head, Mr. Williams. Tyler is trying to reach you. Don't shut him out. He looked up at her, eyes wet, his face lined with grief and anger. For the first time, he didn't see her as just a maid. He saw her as the only person in this cavernous mansion who had truly been watching his son. No more blind trust, Frederick whispered, his voice gaining strength. He slammed the binder shut. From now on, we fight for him. Together. The words lingered in the air, a vow sealed by the fire in his eyes. That night, Frederick ordered the eye drops removed from the house. Not one more drop touches his eyes, he told the staff, his voice booming through the halls. Not one. And before dawn, he was already on the phone, calling in every favor, every connection his fortune could buy. Not to silence his grief this time, but to seek truth. An independent specialist was flown in, a name trusted in the medical world, someone beyond the reach of old betrayals. When the calls ended, Frederick returned to Tyler's room. Regina was there, sitting beside the crib, her hand resting lightly on the boy's chest. Tyler blinked again at the soft light of morning, his gaze searching as if for something just out of reach. Frederick leaned over, his voice breaking with tenderness. "You're not alone anymore, son. Not in the dark. Not ever again." And for the first time in years, a fragile thread of hope stitched itself into the shattered fabric of his heart. The following morning, the specialist arrives. A middle-aged ophthalmologist with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, he wastes no time. He examines the bottles of drops first, holding them against the light, reading the labels, and frowning. "These should never have been administered," he says flatly. "They expired years ago. Their chemical stability would have been compromised, and more importantly, this formulation suppresses photoreceptors. It dulls the eye's ability to process light. Prolonged use would mimic blindness." Frederick goes pale, gripping the edge of his desk. "Are you saying my son was never blind?" The doctor doesn't rush his words. "I'm saying there is every indication your boy's vision was suppressed by these drugs. Whether full restoration is possible, we'll need to run tests. But what you described, blinking, eye tracking, vocal response, those are not the actions of a child lost entirely to darkness. He sees something." Regina's chest tightens at the words. She glances at Frederick, whose expression is caught between devastation and dawning hope. Years of grief crash against the possibility of a future he had never allowed himself to imagine. For the first time, the mansion feels different, like a battle line has been drawn. Not against fate, but against lies, negligence, and time wasted. Frederick turns to Regina, his voice steady, but his eyes wet. "No more silence. No more blind trust. We fight for him. Together." The first morning without the drops felt like a gamble. Frederick hovered by the nursery window, clutching the curtain as if sunlight itself might burn his son. Regina stood a few steps behind, her heart racing. She had insisted the shades be pulled back, that Tyler be given a chance to meet the world unfiltered. When the first rays streamed through the glass, golden and warm, Tyler flinched. His lids squeezed shut and opened again, blinking rapidly. It wasn't random. His tiny head tilted toward the light, and then, like a hesitant miracle, he giggled. The sound was light and gurgling, filling the room that had known only silence. Frederick's throat tightened as if the laugh had been pulled from his own chest. Days turned into weeks, each carrying proof that the impossible was unfolding before their eyes. Regina tested him with small, playful experiments. She dangled a red ball just beyond his fingers, and Tyler's gaze tracked it, his hand swiping clumsily at the air until he caught it. She shined a pocket mirror against the wall, and Tyler followed the reflected beam, squealing with delight. The mansion, once a mausoleum of grief, began to stir with life. Rooms that had been pristine but sterile now echoed with the scattered clatter of toys, the babble of a child rediscovering joy. Regina brought in bright-colored blocks, rattles, and paper windmills. Tyler reached, grabbed, and sometimes toppled them to the floor, each movement celebrated as though it were a grand performance. At night, Frederick would linger by the nursery door, watching Regina crouch low, holding up simple cards she had drawn, yellow suns, green trees, blue skies. Tyler's pupils followed every color. "He sees the world," Frederick whispered one evening, breaking through years of disbelief. For the first time since Isabella's death, his voice carried not despair, but trembling hope. But the change inside the mansion didn't remain secret for long. Word spread after a staff member whispered the news to a neighbor, and soon, a reporter managed to photograph Frederick walking across the estate lawn with Tyler giggling in his arms. The headline was everywhere within days. Maid discovers billionaire's baby not blind. The story electrified the public. Social media buzzed with awe, outrage, and fascination. Some hailed Regina as a heroine, while others condemned the medical establishment that had consigned a child to darkness without thorough investigation. News vans began to line the edges of the estate, and anchors spoke of the miracle on the Hudson. For Frederick, the media storm was secondary to his own private war. Anger burned beneath his newfound joy. He dug deeper into Tyler's medical records and confronted the history that had been hidden in plain sight. The disgraced doctor who had prescribed the drops, the pharmaceutical company that had continued to distribute them despite recalls. Each discovery was a knife twisting deeper, not only because of the injustice done to his son, but because of the wasted months, time he could never reclaim. One evening, sitting in his study with Regina across from him, Frederick set down the thick file of papers with a decisive thud. They stole his chance. They lied. And they're not going to get away with it. Regina said nothing at first. She had learned that grief and rage required silence as much as they did words. But when she finally spoke, her tone carried quiet steel. Then we fight. For Tyler. For every child they might have hurt. The next morning, legal documents were filed. Frederick's lawyers, some of the sharpest in New York, moved to sue the disgraced physician and the pharmaceutical companies that had profited from negligence. The suit wasn't just for damages, it was a declaration. As the legal battle brewed, Tyler's progress became a symbol. Videos of him laughing at bubbles and reaching for toys leaked online, and strangers around the world felt bound to the story. A child once doomed to silence was awakening, and with him, so was his father. Inside the house, the change was profound. Staff who had once moved quietly and somberly now lingered in the hallways to hear the baby's laughter. The walls seemed brighter, as though sunlight had seeped into the very foundation. Even Frederick's own face softened, lines of grief lifting with each new sound from his son. And Regina, who had walked into the mansion burdened by her own secret sorrow, found herself healing alongside Tyler. In his laughter, she heard echoes of the child she had lost, not as pain but as a quiet reminder that love could still bloom in unexpected places. For the first time in years, the mansion wasn't a museum of grief. It was alive. And the world was watching. The courthouse was packed. Journalists jostled for space at the back, their pens scratching furiously, cameras flashing with every subtle shift in the air. At the front, the jury sat stiff and watchful, eyes moving from the disgraced doctor at the defense table to the man who had brought him down, Frederick Williams. But the most unlikely figure in the room was the young maid who now sat in the witness chair, Regina Palmer. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on her lap, but her voice, when it came, carried a steady strength. "I was hired to clean," she began, her gaze flickering toward Tyler in Frederick's arms. "But I couldn't ignore what I saw. This baby everyone believed was blind. He blinked. He reached. He responded. And when no one believed it, I kept watching." The courtroom was silent except for the distant hum of the ceiling fan. Regina's words hung heavy, unadorned yet undeniable. She described the eye drops, the way Tyler grew dull after they were given, the moment he brightened when they wore off. She recounted her late-night research, the medical journals, the discovery that the very doctor seated across the room had been discredited for unethical practices. The defense tried to undermine her testimony, pressing on her lack of medical training. But Regina did not falter. "I may not be a doctor," she said, her voice rising, "but I know the difference between a child trapped in darkness and one reaching for the light." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The turning point came when the independent specialist took the stand. He held up the expired bottles of eye drops, his voice firm. These were designed to suppress photoreceptor activity. Prolonged use would mimic symptoms of blindness. Administering them to a child was not just negligent, it was criminal. The jury needed little more. Within hours, the verdict was delivered. Guilty of negligence, fraud, and endangering a child's health. The doctor's career was over, and whispers in the gallery spoke of the lawsuits that would follow against the pharmaceutical companies that had looked the other way. Outside, the story dominated the national news. Headlines blared across screens. Maid exposes fraud. Billionaire's baby can see. From invisible servant to heroine, Regina Palmer's testimony shakes the nation. But inside the courthouse, amid the thunder of cameras, Regina's focus never wavered from Tyler. She didn't care about the reporters who hailed her as a hero or the offers of book deals that were already beginning to trickle in. What mattered was the little boy who now reached for her finger, his small eyes blinking against the flashbulbs. Weeks later, an award ceremony was held in her honor. It was meant to be a public acknowledgement, a celebration of courage, truth, and justice. Frederick stood beside her on the stage, the billionaire no longer cold and broken but a father renewed. The applause was thunderous, but Regina's attention was only on Tyler, seated in her arms. The crowd hushed when it happened. Tyler, cheeks flushed with excitement, reached up, patted her cheek, and spoke a word that cut through the silence like a bell. "Mama!" The auditorium erupted, not in polite applause but in something rawer. Cheers, gasps, even tears from strangers who had followed the story from the beginning. Regina's eyes filled, her breath catching. For so long, she had carried her own grief in silence, mourning the child she lost. And now, in front of the world, another child had chosen her with a single word. The mansion on the Hudson was no longer a tomb of grief. Sunlight streamed through its windows, laughter echoed down its halls, and the air no longer felt heavy with sorrow. Frederick and Tyler spent afternoons in the garden, chasing bubbles, while Regina watched from the porch, no longer invisible, no longer just the maid. She was family. And for Frederick, who had once believed his life ended with that car crash, there was a new beginning. He had his son, he had hope, and he had the woman who had brought both back to him. This story reminds us, sometimes it isn't doctors, specialists, or machines that change a life. Sometimes, it's the courage of one person who refuses to look away. What did you think of this story? Comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.